too excited by this whole thing?
I guess. They're too nervous.
You should be.
I'd like to begin. Thank you for coming to the session. I'm Jeff Chapman. I'm the moderator of this session, and I'm on the faculty of the School of Policy Planning and Development from the University of Southern California at their Sacramento Center. Let me introduce my fellow panelists up here. At the far right of the table is Steve Frates, who's a senior fellow at the Rose Institute of State and Local Government at Claremont McKenna College. Next to Steve is Mike Shires, who's a research fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California. To my left is Rob Rossmer, who's an associate professor in the Public Policy and Administration graduate program at Cal State Sacramento. All of these panelists have done extensive work on the topic. I think you're going to find that what they have to say is fascinating. I am going to attempt to limit them and myself, and it may be more difficult to limit me than them, to 15 minutes, and then that should leave us a fair amount of time, if I'm successful, for questions at the end. Since I'm the moderator, I get to begin. As soon as I set my timer here to get going. All right, that'll keep me straight at least. The paper I presented that you have, I would just sort of like to elaborate a little bit upon and hit some of the areas that I think are most interesting and ignore some of the areas that are perhaps a little less interesting to stay within the 15 minutes. Let me talk a little bit about where we are now. In the aggregate data, the panelists will describe total expenditures, county expenditures. I'd just like to point out that if you look at the distribution of the property tax, about 10 cents out of every dollar goes to cities. That was, by the way, about what they got in 77, 78. Counties went from about 30 cents out of every dollar to 19 cents. Schools stayed about the same, and the other districts went up from 7 cents to about 18 cents. These numbers are a tiny bit phony because they're huge ranges among counties. And so when you look at any particular average of county ranges, be aware that there's a tremendous variance, and so it's very difficult to generalize. We got to this position through a whole series of events. Table 2 hits the high points or low points. Let me just point out that these events show attempts to solve problems, often in an ad hoc manner, and these problems are closely related to the tremendous growth and change that has occurred in California. And you can't really expect people who are in decision-making capabilities to ignore the fact of growth and change. And you have very smart people trying to do the best they can, and they come up with some rather innovative solutions. The other thing underlying all of this is, my underlying assumption is that Proposition 13 is not going to disappear. It's not going to be overturned. It's not going to go away. Live with it. And we just have to go on. People who say, well, we need to repeal Prop 13, I don't think it's going to happen. At least it's not going to happen within the next decade or so. Just have to sort of, what I would say, look at the consequences. Some were intended, some were unintended, most were unanticipated. And as we look at these consequences, just remember that things will continue to change as we continue. A warning, there's going to be lots of numbers thrown around tonight. Challenge the assumptions. The numbers are accurate. What are controversial are the assumptions that underlie the numbers. I participated in this cottage industry of generating numbers. It varies, such as where do you count San Francisco? Which price deflator do you use? Use the Department of Finance price deflator, use the national government deflator for state and local expenditures. You start making these types of choices, you're going to get changes. Challenge whether we should even be looking at these types of numbers. Maybe we ought to be looking at number of probationers per probation officer. Maybe number of leaky roofs per school. There's other indices. We tend to use the numbers that we have. That doesn't necessarily make them the best. Okay, in my paper I identified 3 sets of unanticipated or unintended consequences, and let me just hit some of them relatively quickly. One is sort of the fiscalization consequences. By the way, these three sets are by no means independent. There's causality running amok among all three of them. So just because I'm talking about them separately certainly does not imply that they're independent. First is what Dean Baczynski first named back in the 80s, the fiscalization of land use types of consequences. Sales taxes were always important. Even before Prop 13, jurisdictions were in competition for shopping malls, for auto centers. It's not a new phenomenon. But what has happened since then, I think, I would argue, has been an intensity of focusing on the sales tax. Decisions are made in more and more on what revenues besides the property tax can this development bring to the table. Sometimes that means employment decisions, economic growth decisions are pushed aside for local financial budgetary decisions. In addition to the sales and land use taxes, we've looked at redevelopment has increased a fair amount. It's increased for a variety of reasons. Blight, until very recently, was extraordinarily easy to define. You could look at almost anything you wanted and call it blighted. The 93 revisions that went into effect in 94 made it more difficult, although I've had comments on my paper that said, nice try, Chab, and it's still pretty much in the eye of the beholder. I think that tax allocation debt is easier to issue than general obligation debt. Doesn't have to go to a vote of the people. The redevelopment agency can issue it, and if you're desperate for infrastructure, you're going to find you go the easiest route. You see redevelopment used not only in terms of redevelopment, but also as a tool of ripping off other jurisdictions to make sure that you can grab their jobs. So if there's a potential movement, for example, Sacramento, and looked at the Packard Bell plant, which I think was in Woodland Hills, and that fit into a redevelopment agency. Good redevelopment helped to rip them off. You get use of it that way, again, because of looking for other ways of finding money. Included in this, by the way, some of the stuff that PPIC has helped do, Mike Dardia's stuff, looking at the pass-through of some of these redevelopment funds. And again, somewhat controversial. Indirectly, by the way, the state might be spending, as polar case, as much as $700 million a year in helping redevelopment go on. Again, something so relatively hidden. You've also seen included in this fiscalization is this increase in fees, particularly redevelopment fees. Crudely, service charges have gone up from 6 to 11% of local government budgets. That's greater than city budgets. That's greater than property tax or sales taxes. It's what we call the welcome stranger effect, where if we can have a new development occurring, sock them with fees to provide a nice park that other people in the jurisdiction can come and utilize. So as long as we could stick it to them, that's fine. You've seen a reaction to this in terms of school finance. In order to get the bonds on the ballot, some of these fees have been pretty much restrained, at least for the next 8 years. Second set of unintended or unanticipated consequences, I argue, are the arcane finance consequences. You have AB 8. AB 8 started complex. It started at over 100 pages, had everything in it from retirement plans from some jurisdictions to who knows what else. It has been tinkered with again and again and again, pushed, stretched. There's a quote I have here from a city finance officer that says, you can never understand this stuff. And this is from a city finance officer. Ultimately, the property tax, I would argue, is no longer a local tax. It is a state tax. The base, the rate, the distribution is really not under control of the local government, except to the extent that local government can get some economic development occurring. But you don't set the rate, they tell you how to assess the base, and the state tells you how to allocate the money. That means in many jurisdictions it's almost exogenous to the budget. What's our property tax? Thank you very much, and then let's move on and see what else we can do. If you think AB 8 is complex, look at education finance. Look at Prop 98, Prop 111. Prop 111, by the way, was a transportation bill that had buried inside it a sort of examination of Prop 98. Different various factor formulas. I argue often that Prop 98 ended up being a ceiling rather than a floor, something that CTA did not particularly anticipate. Sort of let's fund Prop 98 and then see what else we can do. This year, there's been an addition to it. Who knows what will happen? Notice again, aggregate, though, is principally set at the state level. And so local school districts say, where's our money? Thank you, and let's move on. Capital finance, and some brilliant people work in the capital finance section. We have certificates of participation. We got Mello-Roos financing. Relatively easy, COPS especially, relatively easy to implement until some of the reforms that followed Orange County. It was possible to issue COPS on approve COPS on a consent calendar. At times, Orange County did $600 million of this. So it's not trivial. That is no longer legal, thank goodness. Go and ask your friendly city councilman or board of supervisor member, explain how a COPS work. Tell me what a trustee does. Watch what kind of answer you get. And they're voting on these things. Assessment districts, we now have thousands in the state. You look at your property tax bill and you see, oh, I'm in an assessment district 003, 007, 002, and you go, that's nice. Assessment districts are going to be tightly constrained by 218. We'll see how well that works. Again, I have confidence in the fact that there are a lot of very bright people out there who will find ways of dealing with the 218 constraints. Entrepreneurial activities also is a subsection of arcane finance. Public-private partnerships, tax subsidies, development agreements, sometimes hundreds and hundreds of pages long. Not user-friendly for the normal citizen in the jurisdiction. A citizen takes a look at these, tries to figure out what's going on, and immediately calls their local lawyer because they can't understand it. More and more, this is coming to effect. We did have a short period of time where this entrepreneur also dealt with treasury management, and again, I use the Orange County example, where entrepreneur truly was defined. That is becoming more difficult, mostly for publicity. I'm willing to put a bet on the table that within 10 years, something very similar will occur. It happened in San Jose, that predated Orange County. It happened in Orange County. Give me another decade, something like that will happen again. Third function is the increase in state control over local finance. Question here, is it really unintentional? It may have been unanticipated. Is it really unintentional? Again, I've had some significant criticism of some of the things I've said, which is fine. That's part of it. We've seen the ERAF, that's the Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund. This overlaps with arcane finance, by the way, where we have money moving from one to another. The legislature had the opportunity to restore the money. They did not. So is it really unintentional or intentional? Certainly, I think in 1978, that type of finance, that type of centralization was unanticipated. A good side of this is the realignment proposals that have been slowly becoming implemented. I think that, at least on the margin, is beginning to give local jurisdictions a tiny bit more clarity in what their responsibility is and where their source of funds are coming from. Okay, that leads to the reform agenda that I think ought to be at least thought through. I think that there needs to be re-examinations of these allocation and distribution formula. I think they are absolutely murky. I think everything from sales taxes to ABA to education are designed not intentionally to make life difficult, but certainly that's one of the implications. They can't be followed. I think if we re-examine these, my own personal belief is that local control should be, if possible, accentuated. I think that cities, counties need to have a little more flexibility than they have. I think that we need to essentially try to go in that direction. I think a second element of reform in my agenda is to make the system a little bit clearer. Make the debt, the way we finance debt a little bit clearer, make the way we finance education a little clearer, the way the intergovernmental dependencies play out needs to be made clear. Things that the legislature does affect local governments, and sometimes I would suspect some of the votes do not always reflect understanding of the potential impacts that legislative ideas have on local governments. I think the goal of all of this is that we have to deal with an electorate that was unhappy even 7 or 8 months ago, that distrusted government, that were not going to vote even back in January. People were, or back last December, were talking about lack of voters, and people were concerned. And I think an argument can be made that because the system is so difficult to understand, people say, screw it, I'm going to opt out of this whole situation. Let somebody else do it. And so these unanticipated financial events have, at least in part, led to some of this voter dissatisfaction. At that, I will stop, and with 21 seconds to go. And
cool surgical precision.
And reintroduce Stephen Frates from the Rose Institute.
Thank you, Jeff. I just would like to say right off the bat, I agree with everything Jeff said, and not just because he chaired my dissertation committee 15 years ago. And I think Mike and myself and both Professor Stubblebine and Mr. Schrag all agree essentially on the data sets. It's the cut or the perceptions of those data sets. What I'm going to show you is some of the basis of the research that we did at the Rose Institute. We focused on expenditures, and I want to emphasize this isn't revenue, but total expenditures as a percentage of personal income, state and local government expenditures as a percentage of personal income have indeed gone up. They've gone up from about 17.7% of personal income in Californians in the year before Prop 13 to, in 1994-95, the most recent year for which we had data when we did this report, to about 19.1. The mix of those expenditures has changed quite a bit. This graph here shows you how that mix has changed. We think that we have ferreted out, and Dave Lyon mentioned a good point, it is not easy trying to figure out where the federal government money goes and how it wiggles through the rat holes. It's not easy to try and sift out just San Francisco, which is a city and county all by itself. But we have a lot of very bright young undergraduates with better vision than I do, and they can read the fine print in those things, and that's one of the wonderful assets about being at an academic think tank. Net state government expenditures went from 3.6 to 3.7% of personal income. Total expenditures by cities went from 3.6 to 3.9. Expenditures by counties increased from 3.9 to 4.5. Expenditures by special districts from 1.5 to 2.3, pretty healthy increase there. Total expenditures by K-12 public education went down. It went from 4.2% to 3.8% of personal income. Total expenditures by community colleges decreased from 0.7% to 0.5%, and total expenditures by redevelopment agencies, an interesting group, went from 0.26% up to about 0.43, almost a doubling of that. In general terms, government expenditures in California went up. The composition of those expenditures and the revenue streams that supported those expenditures changed. Did Prop 13 do that? To a limited extent, Prop 13 did it, but as Jeff has hit on and other speakers have alluded to earlier, what the legislature did changed the game. And I would emphasize one thing here right now. When we talk about cities, and we talk about counties, and we talk about school districts, and we talk about special districts, keep in mind that they are all technically agencies of the state. Power in the state of California under the Constitution derives from the people to the Constitution. It vests with the legislature the power to enact laws, and those laws enacted by the legislature define what cities can and can't do, what counties can and can't do, what special districts can and can't do, and what other local government agencies, including education, can and cannot do. For a constellation of reasons, as Jeff has sagely pointed out, a complex constellation of reasons, the state legislature has become more involved in education. Part of that was philosophical. It was a dominant position of most of the people in the state legislature in the late 80s and late 70s and early 80s when Prop 13 was passed. Part of it was driven by courts. The Sereno-Priest decision hangs over this tremendously, the idea of equalizing expenditures. It turns out, and we have looked very closely at local government or school district expenditures, that even after Sorrento-Priest, there are huge, huge differences in the per capita expenditures in school districts. We looked at 43 school districts in San Diego County, and we found differences of about 20 to 25% in the revenue streams and expenditures. It's still not unified by any means. Next one, please, Fred. So rather than grind through each one of these, I just point out, to give you an example of how the composition of the expenditure patterns changed for one particular group of local governments. Let's take a look very briefly at cities. We can see here that cities in 1977-78 got 3.6% of the total personal income. By 1994-95, it was 3.9. As Jeff pointed out, for some cities, property tax revenue dropped. For other cities, property tax revenue has actually gone up. Okay? So it's tough to make that categorical statement. Now let's look at the next one, please. And you'll note that city non-enterprise expenditures, what you might think of as traditional government, actually edged down from 2.4% to 2.3% of total municipal expenditures in the state. That's percentage of personal income. But if we look at the next slide, we see that enterprise expenditures have gone up. Now, what does this mean? It means that cities have been more entrepreneurial. It also means something more subtle has happened. Okay, municipal water districts, until recent legislation, in some cases in Orange County, we were looking at Orange County right before the debacle down there. Some municipal water systems were pushing as much as 50% of their gross revenues from the water system into the general fund. It made a huge difference in their cash flow. A more subtle form of shift is taking place now, and that is charging personnel, staffing, overhead, expenditures to enterprise funds from normally general fund activities. City manager charges off 20 or 30% of her time. I'm a lifetime Girl Scout, that's why I say her time. And then the expenditures for the assistant city manager, the finance director, or the finance department are charged off to those entrepreneurial departments. We think that is still part of government expenditures, and we think so for 5 reasons, although my colleague Mike Shires and I have had interesting discussions on this. The first reason is that the people who staff those positions are government employees. The second reason is very often these enterprise entities, whether they're golf courses or water departments within municipalities or what have you, don't pay property taxes or income taxes. The third reason is oftentimes money is shifted between those entities and general fund or other fund activities. The fourth reason, as I mentioned earlier, that staffing gets moved around. There are certain cities in California that we've looked at very closely. We're looking at San Diego right now, where the planning department, I call them the lost battalion. The planning department was up pretty large in the late 80s when housing development was really booming in San Diego. Housing development went south. Things went very flat in the 90s, no more building. That planning department went from being 300 or 400 people to much smaller, 50, 60. Where'd they all go? Well, the sewer department and the water department have increased by roughly the same number of people, all right? And if you walk through the departments and you see where people move, miracle dictu, an interesting change has occurred. So we think, and you can make that argument one way or the other, and I certainly respect Mike's view of it, but we think that entrepreneurial activities have to be looked at in that light. Next one, please. Special district expenditures. We think this is very important because most people don't pay much attention to special districts. Let me put that in perspective. There are 50 some odd counties in the state. There are 480, 490 cities. There's always one incorporating somewhere or another. There are, give or take a few yards, about 1,000 school districts. There are 5,000 special districts. Some of them are small, some of them are small water districts, others are huge. Irvine Ranch Water District gets a huge amount of property tax money because down there, they existed before the cities did. At the time of the Orange County bankruptcy, they were sitting on $500 million in cash. A lot of money. If that money had been shifted to, say, the school districts in the county, you would have seen a very different mix of expenditures. They could have written a check to bail out Orange County, just about. Next one, please. Okay, sneak that down just a little. Public school districts have decreased as a percentage of income. Once again, I don't think we can look at this in a vacuum. I think we have to understand that support for public schools is now manifested at the state level, in part because of Sorrento-Priest, in part because of the decisions that the legislature made in both AB 8 and other decisions after the passage of Prop 13. Okay? The consequences of that, in my mind, have been subtle, pervasive, and detrimental to public education. Jeff jokingly referred to me as on my far right. I'm the House Democrat at the Rose Institute of State and Local Government. I am a product of public education. I was a credentialed teacher, and my mother was a credentialed teacher. I would point out, and Fred Sylvan, my older brother, by the way, are graduates of Fullerton Union High School, the same class. I'm much younger. I would just point out that in North Orange County, where I grew up in Fullerton, where Fred and I grew up, which is not a hotbed of liberal political activity in the 40s and 50s by any stretch of the imagination, school bond issues always passed, and they didn't pass by a little bit. They passed by thundering majorities. Okay? When people saw that the money that they were raising locally went to their local schools, they were very enthusiastic about supporting them. Now what do we have supporting public schools? A very different dynamic, and I call this voting with their feet. If you look at South Orange County and you talk to the people who moved down there, a large number of those people come from urban Los Angeles, and a large number of those people come down there because they want better schools for their children. Now, the expenditure patterns there in some cases are lower on a per-child basis than they are in the LA Unified School District, but that perception about the quality of education and the safety for their children still exists. People vote with their feet. So one of the consequences of Prop 13, and most importantly, the enabling legislation, has been what I call that subtle three-rail bank shot that's tough to trace through, but it certainly does exist. Next one, please. Now, I'm a little more concerned about redevelopment agencies than some people, and I'll tell you why. We looked at every single government entity in Riverside County and produced a 200 or 300-page report on the expenditure patterns in Riverside County, and it was quite sobering what we found. Redevelopment agencies in Riverside County suck up more money than the sheriff and the police departments in the county do. That's a lot of money. It varies from county to county, but there's some serious money going into redevelopment, okay? Jeff Chapman is absolutely right. The fiscalization of land use policy has occurred in spades. Because of Prop 13, yes, to a certain extent, but more pervasively because of legislation that is not directly related to Prop 13, but has huge impact. I'm glad to see the tightening of the redevelopment thing. I suspect that in time it may be time to shut down redevelopment as a concept. I'm not so sure it does what it purports to do, number one, and it certainly leads to huge distortions, number two. When greenfield areas in North Orange County, Brea being a good example, could describe prime real estate on the edge of the 57 freeway, which was unbuilt upon, it was open farmland, as blighted, so major shopping centers could go in, I'm not real sure that we're making good public policy decisions on that score. Next one, please. And of course, there's another little area that hasn't gotten much attention. What's that amazing bar graph there? That's the total public employee retirement system assets as a percentage of total personal income. Okay? That's a lot of money that's going into PERS. How much money? Well, the stock market crashed recently, and of course PERS is a big player, as you know. I have somebody I know from, I'm a graduate of what is now Claremont McKenna, but in those days was Claremont Men's College, a fellow named Henry Kravis, who's big into using money for leverage purposes, tells me that one of the primary sources of revenue he had for his more complex deals was things like the California Public Employees Retirement System, Wisconsin and Oregon retirement systems. But those are big amounts of money. Depending upon who you read and how you look at the numbers, there's maybe 300 billion, B as in boy, billion dollars in that system. Let me put that in perspective for you. The entire Social Security system has, depending upon who you read, $650 billion, okay? This is real money that these people are playing around with. It has a huge impact. Now, I'm not saying that that's not good public policy and that public employees shouldn't be protected in terms of their retirement benefits, but I think that we need to know what it is we are buying with the expenditure of funds. Next one, please, and then I'll get off that topic a little bit. That's just the percentage of total personal income of Californians that goes to the retirement system, and you can see it's pumping up to around 4%. There's a lot of money involved in these kinds of things. So that complex constellation of factors that we're looking at here has made a huge, huge difference. There is another factor that's played into this game too, and that is, and Dave Lyon astutely mentioned this, and that's the impact of federal legislation and contributions to local government and state legislation contributions. That's most acutely the case, not just in education, but in social services. Social service spending has gone up a lot in California, a tremendous amount. county supervisors up and down the state will tell you that they're stuck with what the state mandates. The state loves to mandate things and then not give them adequate funds for executing those mandates. But there's some other disturbing trends in that. We looked at Los Angeles County over a given year period, and one of the things we found that back in 1977-78, for every dollar of public assistance, colloquially welfare if you will, but public assistance in the broadest sense that was allocated to people who were receiving that assistance, there was about 19 cents spent on administration. Now, we looked again in 1994-95, and that number had gone up to 34 cents for every dollar. Now, we also looked at Monterey County a year later, and incidentally, we went into some detail in that kind of expenditure patterns. In Monterey County, as recently as 2 years ago, 54 cents was spent on administration for every dollar of public aid given. So those things have had a huge, huge impact in expenditure patterns. What's the long-term implication of this, other than the fact that I have 1 minute to go? I think every speaker up here has really agreed that Prop 13 had an impact. I think every speaker may argue around the edges of the numbers, but I think most of us, if we really crunched them, would become pretty close. I'd say the big thing that's out there now is that consumerism is going to come to government. It hasn't come yet. It's come to the private sector. The 3 C's of consumerism, as I call them. First is cost. It's the cost of the service. Second, the content, the level of the service delivered, and Jeff mentioned that earlier, how many social workers we get for $1 or how many school roofs we repair. And finally, the comparison. If you were to ask your colleagues, and I do this all the time, how much are you paying for police services in your city individually, most people can't tell you what it is. If you were to find out that you were paying 3 or 4 times as much as the neighboring city, you'd react to it. That's coming in due time, but so's my time is up. Thank you.
That's my fear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The applause from Fred was because I stopped on time.
I have a subtle warning here. My watch goes off, and that scares speakers. Mike Shires.
I'm not going to try and cover as much ground as Steve just did. When PPIC started looking at the issue, at the important state and local finance issues in California, everybody said you have to look at Prop 13's effect on state and local government. And so this was one of the first projects that we actually undertook. And if I have the next slide, Fred. In the spirit of Jeff's comments on assumptions, I just want to talk about what we're trying to undertake. We wanted to try and understand what's happened to the public revenue burden or the tax burden in California. Now, I'm not going to say tax burden because public revenues are much broader than taxes now, arguably as a result of Prop 13. But we set about to try and understand this relationship. And so what we had to do was first identify what kind of revenues there are out there in the public sector. And let me just start off, it's not up there, talking about revenues versus expenditures. There are really 4 reasons that we wanted to deal with revenues instead of expenditures. The first is that our question came from what is the relationship between the people of California and their government? And the most direct, there are 2 ways that happens. One is what they pay to government, and the other is the services they get. Well, if anybody's ever tried to look at service activities and the number of parolees per parole officer and things like that, you quickly end up with so many outcome measures that you have no idea what happened. So we chose instead to look at the relationship between Californians and their government from the perspective of what do they feel out of their pocketbook. And if you look at things like the GAN limit and Prop 218, clearly this is something that's been on the top of their minds. The second reason, as David described earlier today, is that we wanted to be able to control for transfers between other levels of government. If the state counts something as an expenditure for a program, it's much harder to track that expenditure and then to remove it from the numbers than it is to ask the county what money they got from the state, because they're much better at tracking who gives them what. Now, they're very bad at telling you what they spent that money on directly, but they're very good at tracking who gave them the money. The third reason had to do with the issue of capital expenditures. When you look at expenditure data, it typically includes money for buildings, for redevelopment of properties, for remodeling offices and things like that. And the challenge is that is a very lumpy process. Statewide governments do it in good times, and they don't do it in bad times. And so that tends to bias the numbers upward and downward. Whereas what they get is set more exogenously in most cases. It's set outside of their control, and so that's a more consistent reflection of what they get. Now, I will point out, and Steve sort of alluded to this, typically at the local level especially, revenues generally equal expenditures, plus or minus some noise. But unless you want to get into things like COPS financing, of which there are very poor record keeping, it's very, and the expenditure approach can't actually even get at those either, it's very hard to track what's going on. And so we felt that if we wanted to get a sense of what's happened in the relationship between Californians and their governments over the past 20 years, that the best way to do it was to look at revenues. Once we chose that, of course, we wanted to account for revenue transfers, and we did something which Steve and I have talked a lot about. We've removed public enterprise revenues. Now, Fred, let me just hand you this slide here, actually. Which
You said you weren't going to use that.
I wasn't going to use it, but I think the stories that Steve told about some governments transferring lots of money to from their enterprise activities to the general fund does happen, and it varies across counties. And certainly this story isn't true for each one. But in 1978 and 1981, the state did collect both kinds of information. And so we pulled together the money that cities reported as transfers from their enterprise activities, and then we compiled the total enterprise activity revenues. And what you see is that, it's 5 to 7%. And in 1981, I'm sorry, the first column is 1978 and the second column is 1981. In 1981, you would think that cities were under tremendous pressures to be creative in terms of getting money from those entities. So if anything, I would have expected the number to go up. So I think that in general, if you want to get a sense of how much people are paying for government, that if you think of public enterprises and you think of things like utility companies, in some places like San Francisco, those numbers don't even show up on the public books. I mean, you have Pacific Gas and Electric that's providing the services. And so if you want to get a sense of what government's actually doing for you, then you should exclude those revenues. Fred, if you could go back to the assumption slide. I just want to go through the last couple points. The other thing is that one of the things that happens in a lot of cases when people look at the size of the public sector and the public revenues that they get is they use the census numbers a lot of the times, and they include things like higher education. And it's very hard to argue that higher education is something that people are compelled to pay for directly. Now, I mean, to the extent that state transfers money, that's true, but those monies come from your income taxes and your sales taxes. But to the extent that the University of California gets $2 billion, for example, from the federal government to run the Lawrence Labs, if that goes up to $3 billion in 5 years, that's not necessarily a reflection of the growth in government as much as it is a private enterprise. And that money could have just as easily gone to Caltech or USC, which means it wouldn't even show. So we've also excluded those kinds of revenues. And finally, the other thing that we wanted to get at was when we looked at it by level of government, we wanted to have a sense of what kind of revenues different levels of government controlled. And so this approach allows us to also take redevelopment agencies, which are largely controlled by city councils. In fact, I don't know if you've been watching your city council meeting and they go in the other room and put on their other hat and sit down and deliberate the redevelopment issues. And so what we've done in this analysis is that we've actually aggregated special districts into their parents as well. So the next slide, Fred. So what we did was we wanted to know what's happened to the public revenue burden in California in terms of the size, how much money government has received from the people. Now, there's a debate over what's the best measure, whether you control for inflation and control for population, which is the real per capita revenues, or whether you take it as a percent of personal income. And historically, the debate has focused on those two measures because one produces a much higher number and the other produces a much lower number. And as you can imagine, one side would choose one and the other would choose the other. When you make the corrections that we've made in the data, however, you find something very remarkable. They move very closely together and at very similar proportions. And in fact, on a real per capita basis, if you correct for inflation, in 1995, Californians spent about $3,300 for state and local government in 1978. By 1995, that number is about $3,000, which means it went down about 15%. At the same time, you'll notice that it's gone up significantly since 1981. Now, you'll notice there's little spots on here. We only did 5 years because it's a lot of work to add up all these numbers. If we could have the next slide, just to put this in a broader sense, if you use 1978 as your base year, public revenues declined to about 76% of pre-Prop 13 levels in 1981, and then rose to 85% in 1988, all the way up to 90% in 92, and then the last year that we were able to get data in 1995, it was down to about 85%. So what's the moral of this story? Well, if we want to, I'm sorry. Actually, we'll skip that. But the question comes about, Go ahead and put that one up, Fred. The question comes about, why are people concerned about the growth of their government? Well, one of the things you know is that if you adjust for inflation, that you get the picture we just saw, and I've changed it from $1995 to $78 to give you a sense of what it's done if you don't adjust for inflation. And as you can see, people are paying more than twice as much for government today in dollars that they write checks for out of their checking account than they were in 1978. And so part of the tension that's going on here is that it costs, that they're spending more, but in real, if you think about it in terms of the changes in the state, that they actually are spending less. But it doesn't feel like it when they write that check every year. Whoops, that's out of order, Fred. The next slide. So the broad implications are that Prop 13 did result in a significant reduction in the revenue burden in California. It declined by about 25% in terms of the resources that state and local government had. But since 1981, it's risen by 13%. These creative financing schemes that, Jeff and Steve talked about have produced increases in revenues. Now this experience is varied across levels of government. If you could put up the next slide, Fred. If you look at the state, you see that the money that the state generates, that it controls, the money that the state raises and it controls in its own hands. In other words, the income tax and things like that, that the state controls directly, and then that it gets to spend, it's remained relatively flat over this time. But because of the transfer of control of the property tax to the state through the state constitution and AB 8, away from local governments, what you see is that the cities have experienced a significant decline in the revenues that they have available, that they can control. In other words, they go from about 68% to about 38% at the implementation of Prop 13. But then cities, which have the ability to raise those visitor taxes like the transient lodging tax, the hotel tax, and the franchise tax, have been able to sort of buy their way out of that somewhat. And they've also increased fees. And you see that in fact, cities are now at about 43% of the money that they can control and raise. Counties, however, have a very different experience, and this is the story that you often hear people talk about when they talk about local finance. And that's that counties lost control of the property tax and they didn't find anything else that they could generate to replace it. So the frustration that county supervisors have felt since Proposition 13, and the fact that before that they were able to raise money and now they have to simply act as agents of the state or federal government, is very real, and it's driven a lot by this level of control. That's my last slide. But what does this mean to the topic of our discussion? In terms of the consequences of this for state and local government, the flexibility that cities and counties have, especially at the local levels, have largely been used in response to the forces that were brought about as a result of Prop 13. That means in times of recession, instead of being able to turn to their own resources and go to their people and say it's a bad year, we have to generate new resources, they say, please, Governor, help us out. Give us some money. You know, don't take any, and the state at the same time is facing these same pressures, and the state says, well, I'm sorry, but we're going to take your property tax and give it to the school district so that we can buy out the general fund. It's created a scenario where local governments are much more susceptible to swings in the business cycle than they were before Proposition 13. It's also changed the level of discretion that local government has in handling finances, and also for that same reason in determining the kinds of services they want to have for their cities and their counties. Instead of being able to take a general revenue stream and allocate it according to local priorities, they are much more dependent on the state assigning money to them to spend on local priorities. Now, there has been some improvement in some of these areas, things like trial court funding, where the state has bought out their obligation, the county obligation to do trial court expenditures. That will create some flexibility in counties, but it may not affect the most impacted counties, namely the large urban counties, because they get much less of a buyout from the trial court process. So overall, you've created Prop 13 has created, I would argue unintentionally. I don't think local citizens sat down and said we want to make our local government less powerful. A situation where the local governments in fact have much less control over the kinds of services that can be delivered at the local level.
But you could actually grant 2 minutes to Strady if you want.
He probably would.
Probably not. And our last speaker, Rob Wasford from Sac State.
Thank you, Jeff. Let me begin by stating that the research that I'm going to talk about was supported by and is still being supported by a research contract from the Public Policy Institute of California. And it was done jointly with Chuck Anders. I believe it's all up there on that. I will be using slides. I'll be using more slides than Jeff, but much less than the other two speakers, about 3 or 4 slides. And as I tell my public policy students, you don't even need to look at the slides if you want. You can just listen to me. They're just there. The old picture is worth 1,000 words. You know, you'll be able to understand everything. And some of the slides become pretty detailed with small numbers. And what I've done is actually made 25 Xerox copies of the slides for those who really want to look at those numbers in detail. So I'll say that right out. I'm honored to be included among these experts. I'm a little bit worried that I may not live up to them, especially in my time in California. I've only been here for 3 years, but I've been a student of public finance since doing my doctoral work at Michigan State. And believe me, the rest of the country knows about Proposition 13. We talked about Proposition 13. It's considered an experiment that California has run for 20 years, and the rest of the country has looked at that natural experiment. It's not often that economists get to do, local finance economists get to do experiments, and there's been a 20-year one going on in California. So I'm glad that we've gotten together to talk about it. One thing I should mention is I can't leave Professor Stubblebine's remark alone about the assessment freeze. You know, I just moved into a home. There's somebody living next to me who's been there for 20 years. They have kids going to school. They pay 1/4 of the property taxes, 1/3 that I do. And I do not think that that is fair, however you want statistically to justify that they're paying the same on their same assessment amount over the same amount of period. Another issue is that how to get local control back to local governments. The whole problem is that 1% freeze, you know, that is in Proposition 13, and the 2/3 requirement to do anything about that one, which is basically the tyranny of the other 1/3 that's never going to let that happen. Again, the genius of the Jarvis-Gann people, who are notably anti-government types in putting this forth. You know, what would have to be done is allowing local control to lift this 1% and going back to a simple majority. And then the additional thing that should have been done in the beginning with Prop 13 that other states did afterwards is put a cap on how much the rollback on the property tax rate. Roll it back at the rate of the consumer price index, as allowing it to, instead of just having the county or the city board of supervisors or school council having to roll it back manually, having this vote to roll it back, manually roll it back. But I'll leave that and move on to my discussion. When I arrived in California, the perception of the media, from the media and what my reading was that counties were hit the hardest by Proposition 13. So I was interested in establishing myself in California, doing a bit of research specifically on Prop 13. So I said, okay, let me bite off this little chunk and look at how counties have been affected by Proposition 13. Butte County near bankruptcy in the mid-1980s, coming up to Sacramento to plead their case. Other counties following. The LAO, the Senate Office of Research, doing studies on this. It's all pretty well documented. The newspaper articles you read about Prop 13 and how it affects local government, the majority of them are talking about counties and how they are facing cutbacks and what they're going to do. The public concept that's always put forth is annual budget deficits, right? Sacramento County is facing a $20 million annual budget deficit, and these are the things that are going to have to be cut because of it. The insight that economists have brought to this topic is there's more to look at besides just annual budget deficits when you think about fiscal stress or the stress that a local government is feeling because of a cutback in a revenue source. So that's what I wanted to bring to this study. And in fact, look at 2 other forms of stress, both forms of citizen fiscal stress, which is a county government raising too much revenue based upon its characteristics, asking its citizens to pay more than other citizens in a similar type of county with the same type of characteristics. Now that's a difficulty in trying to control for those characteristics, but that's a pretty well established concept, this concept of citizen fiscal stress on the revenue side, and then there can also be citizen fiscal stress on the expenditure side. You know, a county is spending less than what another county is, given these characteristics, and how does that relate to Proposition 13, specifically the AB 8 allocation, which Jeff and others have alluded to. So again, being an economist, I want a tangible number. We know the numbers of how much a county receives in regard to its property tax revenue that's being generated. So I use this in my study. I refer you to Jeff's study. It's an excellent, very well written. I plan on using it in my classes in regard to Prop 13. There's a lot of details in there that I won't talk about, and he does a good job talking about in regard to counties. But remember, counties are administrative arms of the state. They deliver mandated public assistance, protection and health services, and they also deliver local services to unincorporated areas. So that's one thing you have to control for differences across the county. How much of the county is unincorporated? They're going to be spending more. They're going to have to be raising revenue. We do that in our study. If you put up slide 1, again, a slide you can look at, and it's very similar. It is the same as the one that's in Jeff's work on page 7, I believe. He does it in percentage terms. I do it in per capita terms. And you can see why counties were hit so hard, because they had the greatest reliance. I think 1/3 of their revenue came from property taxes. Or up here, $315 for every person of revenue was coming in property taxes. In 94, 95, the most recent data available now, reliable data, it's dropped by 1/3. And that's pretty much the same if you do it in percentage terms of revenue. And you look at the other forms of, where's the money come from? Alternatively, well, the state funds that were backfilled from the very beginning with Prop 13, as the initiative said, it goes to the legislature. They decided to backfill some of it and to take over some of the services. Again, it's all details that you can read in Jeff's report, or you can read in my more detailed report if you want. What has, surprisingly, you haven't seen an increase in real per capita user charges in counties, as noted there, but you've seen it in the form of other revenues, which are license revenues, permit revenues, fines, interest, and the broad category of miscellaneous, which has grown quite big if you look at the current controller report, which nobody really knows what those miscellaneous things are, but it's all lumped in there. Then you go over to the expenditure side, and you look over here, and at least on this number, the per capita expenditure, the total amount, has slightly decreased. In real terms, from before Proposition 13 to afterwards. And there's these raw averages across all the counties, and you can see the big cut has come in what the controller lumps as general government services. Perhaps that's what the Jarvis Gann people wanted, a cut back in government. This is where you could get rid of the waste and bureaucracy and inefficiency if you wanted to, but it could also get rid of a lot of services, that people don't stand in line for 3 hours or 4 hours or 5 hours when they want to have something delivered to them. You also see the increase in protection, which is reflected in the state level budgets, and you see the decrease, I can't even see it myself. You see the decrease slightly in health and slightly in public assistance. And again, these are in per capita terms, no controlling for the caseload that's in the counties for that regard. So that's just a little bit of background. If you go on to the next slide, again, the property taxes not only provide about 1/3 of the revenue for county governments. Basically, you can say that 76% of the revenues coming into county governments, they have no control over, right? And that's pretty well accepted. And Jeff details that in his report. But on the other expenditure side, that's a little bit more difficult. What control does the county have over expenditures? And you have to make some value judgments. I go to what the county supervisors have reported there. Again, remember the bias that the county supervisors are going to try to be emphasizing. But they cite that 57% of their expenditures they have absolutely no discretion over. And then 30% they have virtually no discretion over. So they're claiming that they can only make decisions on about 14% of the expenditures that they make. And again, there's value judgments in here and looking at that. But just a bit of information to give it from the revenue side of how counties are constrained in regard to what they do. A key measurable issue in Prop 13, as I said before, is this allocation of the statewide 1% of property tax revenue and how that was affected. After the passage of Proposition 13, it was turned over to the legislature. They passed SB 154, the emergency legislation, which basically said, let's do the same thing we were doing the previous 3 years. A reasonable thing to do right afterwards. This was made final in AB 8, which passed the next year. And along with that, there were some bailouts to backfill county revenues of stuff that was not being made up with this. If you look at it, there's a 1% revenue is collected within the county, and then it's distributed among the other local governments within the county. And averaging those across all the counties, 77, 78 counties received about 30%. There was a drop right after Prop 13, and then it went back up with the AB 8 formal passage. And they played around with it in the 80s, again exerting their power that it is a state tax and they have the right to play around with it if they want. But on these averages, it's been pretty consistent, about 1/3. Then you get to the early 1990s, right? And you see some changes there in regard to the recession, right? The state got involved with it. the idea, the Prop 98, they needed to have some revenue. They went after and took some money from counties, primarily from counties, but from cities and from school districts. As you can see, a slight drop in those also, and turned it over to school districts. So you see in the, beginning in 1992, increasing up to 94, the percentages going to counties have fallen, and the percentage going to schools have risen, right? Almost a one-for-one trade-off between the two. So just some background on how counties have been affected by AB 8 and the possible fiscal stress that they've experienced because of it. Okay, so if you go over to the next slide, again, this is one of those slides that are, I said, if you want the details, you can come up and get them. But I just want to point out that those aggregate numbers I gave showed what happened to counties on total. School districts that were in worse shape had more money given to them and taken by the county. So there were some differences among counties that you can see. And the average drop, if you look at you can't see at the bottom of that table, but there was a 40% drop in the property tax allocation going to counties over the 90s. But places like Alpine County only had a 9% drop in their property tax allocation, where Orange County had a 65% drop in the allocation going to them, just in raw terms. And that's all the numbers right there showing year by year if you're interested in it. A clear generator of stress when you have a cut in a revenue source and you don't have a decline in service demand. Jeff has written about that and has talked about it in his research. So how do you respond? Well, you go to budget deficits, which the media focuses on, but you can also go to these other type of, requiring your residents to pay more in discretionary revenue or cutting back on expenditure. So that's what we want to look at in an appropriate statistical fashion. We have data from 57 counties. As Jeff mentioned, we throw out San Francisco because of it being both a city and a county government, did not want to deal with that. So we're only using the 57 standalone counties. We use data from 1990-91, the beginning of the recession, to 94-95, the last data that was available at the time. We look at discretionary revenue per capita, we look at total expenditure per capita, and we look at long-term average budget balance. This is one lesson that I want to point out. The media focuses on 1 year. What you should do is look at what's been going on over the previous 5 or 6 years to see an average of what the budget. They can be playing around with shifting creative accounting back and forth between. So we use this long-term budget deficit. Of course, there's no time for details in the study, but we use regression analysis. And we try to predict, using this data set, based upon county characteristics such as service choices, service requirements, local revenue bases, and production efficiency, data that would proxy for others who differ between counties, what they should be doing in per capita terms, right? And an interesting thing that comes out of it is that we do find that the AB8, a county that has receiving a lower AB8 allocation or this lower percentage allocation that was tweaked in the early 90s to help the state out, they don't have greater budget deficits. They don't, that hasn't affected them in terms of running more budget deficits, holding everything else constant in this economist statistical analysis. They don't have lower total expenditure, right? They have been forced to raise greater discretionary revenue, right? So an AB8, something that was basically going on 20 years ago and what your school district was doing in the early 90s, as a county supervisor, you have to go to your citizens and ask them to pay more because of this state control and the allocation of this. So there's a clear example of how Proposition 13 affected different counties differently. Then what we use is we use regressions to predict. You can put the next one up. Again, this will be unobservable probably. We use regressions to predict what a typical county should be doing in regard to discretionary revenue per capita and what it should be doing in total expenditure per capita based upon these characteristics that we have in the regression analysis. Now, I'll be forthright and say that you can criticize my regression analysis, right? It's all based upon what I think causes expenditure differences, what I think the literature interprets causes expenditure differences, and that's the point of criticism if you don't like what I'm putting up there. Up to this point, I just put up raw numbers that come from the controller, and there's probably mistakes there, but you have to go back and criticize that. So there is this regression analysis that is room for criticism. And then what we do is let's take a look at different counties in 94, 95. Proposition 13 has hurt all counties in regard that they relied on property taxes so much. What's the distinction between different counties and how they've been affected? And what it shows up there is that, yes, there is differences in regard to their long-term average budget balance, and some counties are also relying, such as Alameda County is raising 6% more discretionary revenue than would be predicted to raise, spending 5% less than what it would be predicted to spend, and it's running a long-term deficit of $6, an average of $6. These are in per capita terms. Whereas other, so a county that says we're having budgetary difficulties, this is one way of looking at it. They're making their own effort in regard to trying to correct these budget deficits, if they're going to raise the discretionary revenue or cutting back on expenditures. You know, it's a cruel world out there, and that's how the counties have to deal with it. This is one way of going back to a county in this measure and looking at it. In conclusion, all counties underwent fiscal stress after Prop 13. Stress is going to be worse in recessions. That's why you don't hear about it too much now. But Sac County is asking for a sales tax increase right now. And something really needs to be done in regard to this AB8 allocation. And we have some specific suggestions in this study. Probably it's going to have to be sharing within the county itself as opposed to some type of imposition from outside. Thank you. And if you want a copy of the entire report, please contact me at Sac State, and I'll be able to get you this 100-page report to have all the gory details if you would like them.
Thank you, Rob. Well, because of my nasty stopwatch up here, we actually have time for questions. So the floor is now open for questions. Back there.
Revenues.
Revenues.
You look at revenues.
It's my job to summarize the question so that they can answer, and Mike has just volunteered to do that.
Well, I think the question was, does whether you use revenues or expenditures really affect the outcome of the analysis and the kinds of assumptions you use? And the answer is the assumptions you use does. I think that whether you use revenues and expenditures, if you can control for things like intergovernmental transfers and capital allocations, is probably not as critical as those assumptions. And the biggest difference between Steve and my numbers, I think, is how we handle public enterprise activities. And I mean, he lists several reasons why they should be included. I tried to list several reasons why they shouldn't be included. You know, this is always going to be the case in any type of public analysis, that clearly the assumptions make a difference. I just restate, I think the biggest reason why you wouldn't want to include public revenues, and then I'll let Steve say why you would want to, is that these are activities that go on, and I'm not sure about the characterization of entrepreneurial activities that Steve used from the perspective that, at least I know the San Bruno Water Company is not the most entrepreneurial agency that I've met. Some of those people who are showing up in those offices could well be planners that are doing general planning activities for the city. I think the alternative description of what's going on is that the city in the past subsidized some of the planning activities that went on for those agencies, and that in fact those people are just being put where they belonged in the first place. Now, there's probably an element of truth to both things, and I'm sure it varies by entity. So,
Well, I think that's a good point, and I'm glad you brought up that question. It is fundamentally a different way of looking at it. I think we're looking at the same data sets. It's how we parse them. I would reiterate the reason that I say public enterprises are expenditures because they're government entities and they don't pay taxes. If they were, you know, they pay like San Diego Gas and Electric or Pacific PG&E, they pay franchise fees and their employees would pay, I mean, not the employees, but the enterprise itself would pay corporate taxes and those kinds of things. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, I think if you take that out, we probably agree pretty much on the numbers. Whether government should do that, engage in those activities, I think, is a philosophical question. The second, if I understood you correctly, the second issue is the way that we look at the expenditure patterns is revenues or expenditures, if you will, as a percentage of personal income versus the deflator that Bob used or the one that Mike used. The reason that we do that is that there's all kinds of debates about which deflator is right and which criteria is used. But if you look at total personal income, that measures the ability of citizens to pay taxes, okay? And as a percentage to buy anything, to go to Nordstrom's or to buy used Ferraris or whatever they spend money on, that total personal income is what's available. And the slice that government takes of that under whatever guise is, in our view, the most important criteria. Different way of looking at it, and it's both an astute and legitimate question. I think we have legitimate differences from the policy standpoint about those.
Yeah, I'm going to answer, I think, the third part of the question, which maybe I'm reading into it, and that is, I think you concluded by saying, where's all this money that I'm supposed to be able to spend? I mean, I feel stressed. And maybe there's a little variation about how you deal with enterprises and so forth. And I guess I would answer that by saying there's never been enough money. If you went and looked at the newspapers in 1970, you would see cities and counties and special districts saying, we don't have enough money. And so it's sort of hard to pin all of that on Prop 13. I go home and I got a whole family that says, we don't have enough money. It is part of why we call budget constraints budget constraints. I think, though, that you feel stressed is because smart people have found, I argue, smart people have found ways of getting the money, but it's not easy. It is using arcane instruments. It's voting on things that you're not particularly confident what's happening when you vote on them. There's never enough money, and two, somehow or other people find money to get stuff done, but it's very uncomfortable given these artificial constraints. Yeah. So it's sort of the Jerry Maguire, show me the money. It's there, but it's not easy to get to.
I just want to add one other point, too. I think it's important to recognize that neither Steve nor Rob nor I or Jeff have been able to talk about the service mix that's produced. And the fact of the matter is that we've seen changes in those service mixes. Right. We've seen changes in the financing for specific services. I can no longer go to San Bruno City Park and use the big spot without paying a fee. 10 years ago, I didn't have to do that. There have been changes, and people feel that. And I think that it's the efforts the government goes through to do those kinds of things that creates the kind of pressures that you feel when you're working in City Hall or in the county offices.
Yeah, Steve McShane, a Senate Associate for this next year. Question for Mr. Shires. Where is the money going from these city entrepreneurial activities? If it's not going back to the city, where are they spending it? And is there any opportunity to try to reallocate that money or channel it more towards the cities so that they can be relieved, or the counties for that matter?
Well, did everybody hear the question?
The question was, where does the money go for city or county enterprise from county enterprise activities and city enterprise activities? I mean, the definition sort of an enterprise activity is it's a product group that sort of gets funded in theory based on the cost in the case of public entities of providing that services. For example, San Bruno Water Company estimates the cost of providing water services and then goes to the city council or to their governing board and gets authorization for what water fees they're going to charge next year. So in theory, at least, all that money is passed through, much as it would be in the private sector. And theoretically, at least, those prices should be a little bit less because they don't have to pay taxes.
That's right.
And they don't have to provide a profit for shareholders.
It might be helpful to think of it as fee for service, very much like Mike was talking about the San Bruno Park or the water system. In theory, the fee that you pay for the service pays for the delivery of that service. So when you pay your water bill, if it's to a municipal water system, it pays for the delivery of that water service.
Yeah?
Question about the redevelopment of the address, particularly as Steve Freitas put into the panel. Address actually two questions. One has to do with the magnitude of the impact on the general fund of those cities, some counties that have redevelopment agencies. I don't recall whether you discussed that. And the other is, what is the pattern of disparity among California cities in terms of being in the redevelopment business and taking advantage of those incremental reallocated property taxes?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. First, repeat the question. The gentleman's first question was, with regard to redevelopment, what's the magnitude of the impact of a redevelopment agency activity on general funds of cities and counties. And then the second one is how big a disparity between these various agencies is there? And the answer to both is yes, but let me explain that a little bit. The magnitude of the impact is really, in many respects, a function of time and the characteristics of the redevelopment. In some cities, there are huge redevelopment agencies, and those redevelopment agency function has been established quite some time ago, so as the redevelopment works on the principle of the tax increment, it freezes the money that goes to the existing governments, and then the additional increment revenue from the property tax assessment as it goes up accrues to the redevelopment agency. And some of those redevelopment agencies have a tremendous amount of money. Is it the same for all cities? No, because of a whole host of reasons. How long has the agency been there? How big is the redevelopment agency's area? What economic activity took place in that redevelopment agency? We were recently, as I mentioned, looking in Riverside County. We looked at some detail down the Coachella Valley, and I believe, I can't remember the city, but I think it's Palm Desert. Something like 40% of the city is a redevelopment agency. So yeah, that impact is huge, and what does it take from the general fund? All that incremental dollar that goes up. In other communities, those redevelopment agencies are both smaller in their size and scope. They haven't been around as long, and hence the impact is less. It also, frankly, makes a difference between how recently a city has been incorporated. It makes a difference. There's a huge difference depending upon the stock of the property tax, the property in the city, whether it's been developed or undeveloped, and all those kinds of things. So it gets very complex very quickly.
I think there's two other aspects, too, that sort of mitigate the impact on the general fund for the city. The fact of the matter is they do get considerable money. It's in the billions of dollars that are directed to redevelopment agencies, but there are limitations on what some of that money can be spent for. Some of that money is passed through to the local government, and one of my colleagues actually has looked in detail at what those levels should be. But there's also the issue of what they can spend the money on, and a lot of times the main impact on the general fund may well be through sales tax, through activities generating sales tax. Sure. Through attracting big box retail and stealing, cannibalizing sales tax revenues from neighboring jurisdictions and activities like that. And that can actually be the larger long-term impact on the city.
Yeah, Jeff mentioned fiscalization of land use policy. When you see an automobile mall being slapped up next to a freeway, one of the drivers is there's a clever city manager there somewhere who says, gee, if we sell a lot of automobiles, we get 1% of that sales tax revenue, or a Home Depot or Walmart or things of that sort. So yeah, it changes the game a lot.
Could I just add one thing? I mean, coming from outside of California, right. I mean, everybody makes this big deal about fiscalization of land use, that it's caused by Prop 13. Well, in other states, they chase after property taxes. Sure. You know, Prop 13 did not cause the fiscalization, no matter what Dean Mazinski says. Local finance economists have known about that all the time. Yeah. If it wasn't sales taxes, they'd be chasing something else. If we went to local income taxes, they'd be chasing high-income people to come into there, right. You know, and zoning out other smaller homes so they could come in. So it's always going to be there.
Actually, they do chase higher-income people to come in. It's called large lot zoning.
Large lot zoning.
I was wondering if there was another possible impact out of Prop 13 in this effort to chase the dollar, if you will. I would argue that in the last 20 years, the intent of government has shifted, and I think the earlier speakers talked about it, and you were kind of addressing it. There seems now, as you chase the dollar, to begin the loss of the quality of the service. Now, it's really hard for a city manager when you're trying to balance your budget, and you don't have
So the question is, given the stress, how has that affected services? Yeah.
Gee, I got one, huh? Well, the fact of the matter is it varies tremendously from government to government and city to city. I mean, we looked at Monterey County, for example, and the city of Monterey and Carmel, which are nice little jewel boxes that all those wonderful people from the peninsula come down each weekend and spend money like sailors in port. Isn't it wonderful to get a slice of the sales tax revenue? There's no question, you're absolutely right. The physical stress of having to chase other revenue sources because the property tax is not as flexible or viable for an individual community changes the chemistry. That varies from community to community through those 400 and some odd cities and the 58 counties.
Let Rob talk a little bit about counties.
I think part of your question was about just upon expenditures and how it translates into what people are actually concerned about, the quality of service delivery. And you know, as economists and up here, we look at all these numbers and we say, you know, real spending is the same or less before or after Prop 13, or even as a percentage of total income, which you can look at. But you know, the debate actually becomes that how does those dollars translate into what people want, and what type is the society that we're living in now the same as what it was in pre-Proposition 13 times? You know, is it more complex? Is it what economists call more externalities, more market failures, more desire for public goods that need to be provided by local governments? And so even if the expenditure level is the same as it was before Proposition 13 in per capita terms as a percentage of income, there are those issues that people may be feeling it in that they're not getting what they actually want. And economists have always grappled with that, of how to figure that out. And then you go to things like Jeff was talking about, looking at the number of police per people or the number of crimes, look at actually the outcomes of the city services. And some of that stuff, you can definitely see changes in California. As we all know, that's the Peter Schrag type of idea.
Actually, I would also chip in that, I mean, in fact, there probably have been some efficiency improvements over the last 20 years in the production of local services. And I don't think those necessarily have to come at the cost of quality. A lot of organizations, a lot of local governments simply change their product portfolio. I was, to date myself a little bit, I was in high school when Prop 13 was passed, and instead of offering 3 sports teams, we had 2. Was it a massive decline in the services at that school? Probably not, but we felt it. I think that there has been some efficiency changes. There's also been a reflection in the preferences of the local population of the willingness to fund these things. I mean, there's a reason why a city can impose fees on parks, and that's because the citizens of that city allow it to happen, and they're willing to pay that price in order to have access to better facilities. So I'm not sure that Prop 13 automatically generates a decline in the quality services. I think it just calls for more creativity and a better prioritization of what services are important to the community.
I think it's important to think of that too, and as both Rob and Mike have talked about with cities. In counties, somebody touched on earlier the question of mandates, state mandates, and the huge impact the state has. If you look at mandates in 4 categories, one is what I call mandated activities, where the state says not only will a county do it, but they'll do it to a certain level. They'll provide certain social welfare costs or aid to families with dependent children, or they'll take care of dependent children who are orphaned in some way in a particular criteria. They're very specific criteria, either set by the legislature or by courts, about what can and can't be done. That's very different than what I call mandated discretionary costs. The state law says that each county will have a sheriff and the sheriff will run a jail. It doesn't say that the sheriff's going to have a fleet of helicopters and he's going to buy new cars every year, and the guys are going to go swaggering around with brand new Berettas on their hip. They may have to survive with revolvers. There's a question of degree there. And then you get down to, of course, the discretionary things that counties can do, which you pointed out, Rob, in your chart, which I thought was a good one. It's odd to me, but it's quite interesting to me that the state legislature usually sets up discretionary expenditures in a way that are most sensitive to people. For example, at the county level, libraries and parks are invariably discretionary because the state says, okay, if you rednecks down there in Orange County want to cut expenditures, or don't want to pay taxes, well, what are you going to do about parks and what are you going to do about libraries? It'd be a lot of fun to have all 58 states be able to get a block grant or 58 counties get a block grant from the state and then set their spending priorities. And no, baby, that'd be a real kick, because you'd see a huge difference in the amount of service delivery and the mix of service delivery. Cities have more flexibility in that. Schools, in some respects, have very, very little.
Julie?
I need some clarification on the definition of
Redevelopment is a fascinating topic. And yes, by law, 20% of redevelopment expenditures has to go for, not revenue, expenditures has to go for housing. And over the last several years, they've been monitoring it more and more carefully to make sure it happens. But redevelopment, by definition, has to deal with blight. So if you don't have blight, you can't have a redevelopment project, period.
Even when they're dealing with economic development projects, there has to be a blight element.
Well,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, that's
you
what
can't-
drives the equation.
Yeah, you
And
can't
again,
have redevelopment without blight.
It gets pretty hilarious sometimes. Indian Wells down in the Coachella Valley, which is a very affluent community with a per capita income of, I don't know, $75 million or $75,000 per year. 75 million, that's a little rich. 75,000. Their redevelopment project had to do with, one of them had to do with relining the water hazards on the municipal golf courses. Okay, were they blighted? Well, you know, judgment call. But, you know, those kinds of things you want to look at very, very precisely when you look at the definition. One of the things, by the way, that's going on now is there is an attempt at a secondary market in the housing thing, where an affluent community will say to another community, we'll give you our 20% off the top, you take the lower cost housing because it's too expensive or we don't want it. So there's all that kind of stuff going on too.
Yeah, every now and then, when I'm in a really crazy mood, I might think about taking the RE part of the redevelopment agency, just sort of be honest, call them development agencies, put together a whole new set of ways of looking at them, and stop the game, and just, again, try to be clear as to what's going on. This goes far, about that far when I try to propose it. Yeah.
In the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," and lo, there was light.
Or at least the state legislature, which may be God in California. So,
Other questions? We have time for one more. Okay, sure.
Steve's question or comment about state mandates reminded me of something, and it seems like the state came into some of the mandated costs to create sort of cottage industry consultants to assist in the billing. How much siphoning off of some of this return of the revenue and trading that really is creating kind of that contrary to efficiency or quality movement we're giving out?
boy, are you cynical. Let me preface.
Repeat the question.
Okay, the question is in the state mandate biz, where the state mandates can get, as those of you in local government know, increasingly complex and arcane and very difficult to fulfill. There is a cottage industry of I don't want to say former state legislative assistants, but some cynics might say that, who generously write the complex laws and then go around and peddle their expertise to local governments. Yes, it exists. Boy, I wish I could get a slice of it, but I don't understand them either. But more important, and I think if I understand the thrust of your question, is this good public policy to have these mandates and the implementation so complex and arcane that you have to be a Philadelphia lawyer to decipher them. And certainly from my viewpoint, and I would suspect for all of us up here, that we would favor simple, clear, more discernible types of laws concerning all sorts of mandates. But when you say siphoned off, do you mean to consultants or?
Yeah, paid to consultants.
Oh, that's a trade secret. We can't reveal it.
However, if you'd like my card.
Yeah. I don't know.
I think we're at the time. Okay, well, thank you very much for the panel. We enjoyed it. I hope you did too.